You're about to hear the story of the most twisted Appalachian family you've never known. 1978, Kentucky Appalachians. But before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now? I want to see every state, every country, every town in the comments. And stay with me, because what I'm about to share is unlike anything you've ever imagined. No one from the valley had ever dared to speak of the hollow after dusk. Even whispers carried warnings, as though simply naming the place could draw attention. The mountains rose on all sides, steep, rugged, and impassable to anyone unprepared. Yet it was here that a family had lived, hidden from the world, their lives shaped in silence over generations. I had heard the stories, fragments passed down by elders who would quickly hush themselves, their eyes darting toward the hills as though someone might be listening. They said the family was strange, unusual, but never violent, at least not in a way outsiders could comprehend. I did not know what compelled me to step past the first boundary of the hollow. Perhaps it was curiosity, though that word feels inadequate. Perhaps it was something darker, or simply an unshakable need to witness the lives of those who had existed entirely apart from the rest of the world. As I crossed the first creek, the air thick with the smell of wet bark and moss, I felt an immediate weight press against my chest. The forest itself seemed aware of my presence, the branches above swaying gently as if warning me to turn back. Yet I did not. The forest felt alive, not in the way one might imagine, a chirping of birds or a gentle wind, but in a deliberate, measured consciousness that made me second-guess every step. The trees leaned slightly toward me, the moss clinging to their trunks like watchful eyes, and the undergrowth, thick and uneven, seemed to slow me, to measure my persistence. Every footstep was amplified, each snap of a twig echoing like a signal into the depths of the hollow. I could feel eyes on me, though no one was visible. My instincts screamed to retreat, but I was already too far in, and I could not stop. It was then I noticed the first signs of human life, or at least evidence that someone had passed here recently. A small wooden swing hung from the lowest branch of an ancient oak, weathered and grey with age, swaying faintly despite the absence of wind. Leaves were disturbed along the path, footprints in mud that seemed intentionally placed, some small and light, others heavy and distorted, as though whoever or whatever had walked here wanted to be noticed, yet remained hidden. I realized that I had crossed a threshold, and that the hollow was no longer just a place in the mountains. It had become a presence, a living force that observed, measured, and understood every intrusion dash. I pressed onward. The cabins I passed were empty, yet alive with traces of those who had occupied them. The faint smell of smoke that lingered in the timbers, a chair slightly displaced, a bundle of herbs tied carefully with string and left to dry. These were not signs of neglect, but of deliberate routine. The family's habits were encoded into the landscape itself, visible only to those willing, or foolish enough, to notice. Every observation deepened my unease, yet drew me closer, compelling me to continue, as though some unseen hand guided me forward. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. The mist thickened, curling around tree roots and stones, softening edges, obscuring paths, and creating illusions that were almost convincing. At the edge of a clearing, I glimpsed movement, a figure crouched low, watching. I froze, heart pounding, eyes straining, yet when I blinked it was gone. A trick of the light, perhaps, or the deliberate concealment of someone who had lived here all their life, perfectly attuned to the forest and the ways it could hide them. The sense of being observed intensified with every step, yet I could not turn back. Night began to settle over the hollow. The forest transformed, every sound magnified, every shadow imbued with possibility. A distant creek became a dark ribbon of mirrored light, reflecting the first pale hints of moon, but distorted and shifting in ways that defied ordinary perception. I could hear whispers, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind, tones that were human, yet not quite, layered as though multiple voices spoke at once. Leaves rustled behind me, yet the air was still, the mist unmoving. My pulse hammered, my breath came in shallow bursts, and I knew with certainty that the family was aware of me, though I could not see them. And then I saw the first glimpse of the children. Figures flitting between trees, their movements precise, deliberate, almost choreographed. They did not run or play in the ordinary sense. Their motion suggested observation, assessment, the way a predator might study its environment before revealing itself. One paused, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. The gaze was empty of malice, yet filled with recognition, awareness. And in that instant, I understood that I was intruding on something far older, far more deliberate than I had imagined. The forest, the hollow, and the family itself were intertwined, and I had entered their domain. The forest around me deepened with every step. What had been ordinary shadows in the late afternoon now thickened into shapes that seemed to breathe. Each tree loomed larger, its bark rough and grooved like the skin of some ancient creature. The moss on their trunks gleamed faintly in the silvering light, as if wet with dew, or perhaps something else entirely. Every sound, my footstep, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow, seemed amplified, resonating through the hollows in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was no longer simply a walk through the mountains. It was an entrance into a world that had existed, hidden, apart from the ordinary flow of time. I stumbled across the remains of an old cabin, its timbers warped and cracked. The door hung at an angle, creaking with the gentlest movement of the air, and inside the faint light revealed a scattering of objects left behind. A faded blanket folded with precision, a small bundle of herbs tied with string, a wooden bowl still holding remnants of dried roots. Each object felt intentional, like the remnants of rituals I could not comprehend. I could sense, almost palpably, the presence of those who had left them, the family itself, or whatever remnants of their ancestors had survived through the hollow. The space felt observed, almost sentient, as though the walls themselves remembered who had passed through and who was daring to intrude. A low wind brushed across the clearing, carrying sounds that I could not fully identify. A branch cracked sharply in the distance, startling me, yet when I turned, the forest was empty. There was no movement, no figure, no trace of anyone, yet the sensation persisted. I was being measured, assessed, and every instinct in my body screamed caution. The hairs on my neck and arms bristled, the weight in my chest grew heavier, and yet the pull of curiosity drove me onward, deeper into the hollow. The forest seemed almost to guide my path, bending its terrain subtly, hiding or revealing small details that I could not fully interpret, but that I instinctively knew were significant. And then I saw them. Not all at once, but glimpses that were enough to unsettle me beyond words. Children, or figures shaped like children, darted between the trees, moving with a precision that was impossible for someone so young. Their heads tilted at angles that suggested understanding far beyond their years. They did not run. They did not laugh, as ordinary children do. Instead, they observed, waiting for me to make a misstep, aware of my intrusion before I was aware of their presence. My pulse quickened, and my eyes darted from shadow to shadow. But whenever I focused, the figures vanished, leaving only footprints, impressions in the mud, or objects slightly displaced, as if marking my passage. I followed a narrow trail that led me past a small creek. The water ran black and mirror-like, reflecting the pale light of the early evening, but warped in ways that made the shapes within it indistinct. Rocks along the bank bore unusual marks, tiny scratches that suggested fingers or claws moving with intent. Leaves floated downstream, catching on branches, and for a moment I thought I saw a face staring back at me from the water's reflection. My heart thudded violently in my chest, yet when I looked again, there was nothing, only the hollow, silent, and watching. By the time I reached the next clearing, the mist had thickened to an almost tactile density. The shapes of the trees blurred, and shadows deepened into forms that suggested movement without clarity. At the edge of the clearing, I saw the first real signs of deliberate human, or human-like, behavior. Small markers had been placed along the perimeter, rocks stacked in intricate patterns, twigs interwoven into spirals, the faint outline of symbols carved into the bark of young trees. Each mark carried intention, an invisible language meant for eyes that could interpret it. And I, an intruder, could feel their weight pressing against my perception, even if I could not understand their meaning. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate hum that rose and fell, seeming to emanate from the trees themselves. It was low, melodic, but impossible to place. The sound carried a rhythm that my mind recognized instinctively, like a heartbeat, but not my own. It was layered, as if multiple sources were producing it in harmony, yet no visible mouth or instrument was present. I froze, straining to locate it. The forest was alive with it now, every movement of wind and leaf synchronized with the hum. I felt the hollow itself breathing, aware of me, testing my resolve, and I knew with certainty that the family was near, hidden, and fully aware of my presence. Shadows moved again, more distinctly this time. A figure slipped from tree to tree, pausing only long enough for me to sense its shape before vanishing into darkness. Then another appeared, smaller, crouched, head tilted in curiosity, observing my every move. I stepped forward, hesitant, my boots sinking slightly in the damp forest floor. Every instinct urged me to flee, yet some inexorable part of my mind compelled me to continue. And then, at the far edge of the clearing, I glimpsed the outline of the main house, nestled beneath a natural hollow in the hill, obscured by overgrowth, but unmistakable in its presence. Windows were dark, yet reflective, catching fleeting hints of movement that may have been real, or a trick of the mist. I approached slowly. The door hung at a precarious angle, but I could sense the intention behind its placement, as though the hollow itself had arranged it. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth, smoke, and something sharper, something metallic and ancient. Shadows shifted along the walls, the corners deepening, and a soft, deliberate sound echoed from somewhere within. A scraping, faint but rhythmic, impossible to place. My heart raced. I realized then that I had crossed a line. I was no longer merely observing. I was participating, entering a space meticulously controlled by a family whose understanding of isolation, routine, and observation far exceeded any conventional measure. The further I pressed into the hollow, the more the forest seemed to shift around me. Paths I had previously crossed now curved unexpectedly, leading me past the same gnarled trees I thought I had already passed, yet arranged differently, subtly, as if the land itself was guiding, or testing, my movements. Every sound now carried multiple layers: the distant rush of a stream, the whisper of leaves, the soft snapping of twigs, all merging into a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. I could feel my pulse in my ears, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness, as though the forest amplified my presence deliberately. A low fog began to rise from the creek, pooling in depressions in the earth, curling around tree trunks and branches like a living thing. The mist moved with purpose, settling into hollows, lifting suddenly, revealing glimpses of movement that vanished when I tried to focus. Shadows elongated, shifted, and sometimes overlapped in ways that made the forest feel almost three-dimensional in its threat. I could no longer discern solid form from illusion. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred until every step forward felt like walking through a dream I was unwilling to wake from. Then I heard the first unmistakable sound of life, a faint shuffle behind me. I froze, listening, every muscle taut. Footsteps. Not quite. They were uneven, hesitant, deliberate. I turned slowly, but the forest remained empty. A chill ran down my spine, the sensation of eyes pressing against the back of my skull. I exhaled quietly, and the fog thickened again, curling over my boots. Something was here, watching, but it did not reveal itself. The suspense was suffocating, a heavy weight that settled over my chest and made each breath feel labored. And yet, some part of me insisted on moving forward, drawn by curiosity stronger than fear. I came to a small clearing, faint moonlight cutting through the branches, illuminating what I first thought were scattered stones. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were deliberate markers, rocks stacked in intricate patterns, twigs arranged in spirals, faint carvings etched into tree bark that seemed to form symbols, signs, or perhaps records. It was meticulous, exacting work, a language I could not interpret, yet I felt its significance. Each marker seemed to watch me as much as I observed it, a silent message that this space was not random. It belonged to someone, or something, who understood observation as intimately as breath. From the corner of my eye, a small figure moved at the edge of the clearing. A child, or what appeared to be a child, slid silently between shadows, head tilted, body stiff with intent observation. The eyes, though dim in the half-light, seemed impossibly aware. For a moment, our gazes met, and I felt the weight of comprehension from someone, or something, too young to possess such awareness. Then it vanished, melting into the mist, leaving only the echo of its presence. My legs trembled, but I pressed onward, compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination. I realized that every motion, every shadow, every mark in this clearing had been placed for observation, teaching, or measurement. The family was always present, even when unseen. I followed a narrow path that led deeper into the forest, the undergrowth thickening until every step was deliberate, measured. Branches brushed against my jacket, leaves clung to my boots, and the mist pressed against my skin like a damp veil. Sounds of the forest, once comforting, became layered with tension. The creek murmured softly in the distance, yet its rhythm seemed to echo the beat of unseen footsteps. A rustle behind me suggested a presence, a companion, a shadow. I spun, only to find empty space, yet the impression of being observed remained. I was acutely aware that each choice I made, the path I took, The stones I stepped on, the trees I brushed past, was recorded, assessed, and understood by those who lived here. The clearing expanded again, revealing another set of structures. A small cabin, partially hidden by vines, its roof sagging and warped. The door creaked slowly, inviting me to peer inside. The interior smelled of damp wood, earth, and something faintly metallic, like rust or iron. A small chair sat in the center of the room, tilted slightly as if someone had recently departed. Bundles of herbs, dried and bound with string, rested carefully on the floor. I could sense the presence of those who had arranged them, even if they were nowhere in sight. It was deliberate, calculated, and I felt the hollow itself pressing a warning. Observe, but do not overstep. From behind the cabin, a shadow flitted across the clearing. A child, crouched, silent, moving in ways that were almost unnatural. Its head tilted, eyes following, and I realized that what I had been interpreting as mere shadow or movement was more. The family's children were extensions of the hollow, trained, shaped, raised in silence and observation, masters of stealth and awareness in a way that was terrifying. Every instinct told me to retreat, yet I could not. The narrative of the hollow, the story it had written over generations, was unfolding, and I had become part of it. The forest seemed to pulse now, the mist thickening, shadows growing longer. Branches swayed without wind, leaves fell in patterns that made no ordinary sense. From the edge of my vision, I glimpsed more figures. Children, adults, perhaps ancestors themselves, moving between shadows. No words were spoken, yet the silence spoke volumes. I felt measured, studied, assessed. Each step I took was recorded, a subtle lesson in presence and perception. The hollow and its inhabitants had existed for generations, their customs and behaviors preserved through isolation and vigilance. And now, I was an intruder in their carefully constructed world. Then I saw the first real sign of ritual. At the far end of the clearing, small objects had been arranged deliberately in the dirt. Stones in concentric circles, sticks interwoven into patterns, faded carvings in nearby tree bark. Some objects were partially buried, some suspended from branches by string. The arrangement carried intention, purpose, repetition. I could not understand it, could not name it, yet I knew instinctively that it was important. It was a record, a lesson, perhaps even a test. And as I studied it, I felt eyes on me, unseen, intelligent, aware. The family was here. They were always here, in the shadows, in the trees, in the patterns of the earth. A soft, deliberate hum rose from the clearing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, then layered, harmonic, resonant. I could feel it vibrating through the soil beneath my boots, through the mist, through my chest. It was alive, or at least it seemed to be, an invisible rhythm guiding the hollow, attuned to presence, movement, and intrusion. I froze. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the shadows stilling, the mist coiling in response. The hum carried intent, and I realized with a sinking certainty, the hollow, the family, the children, even the trees themselves, they were aware of me in a way I had never experienced. Figures emerged once more, fleeting glimpses at the edge of my perception. Children or childlike figures moved with impossible precision, their gestures synchronized with the rhythm of the hum. One paused, crouched, tilted its head. Our eyes met, and in that instant, the world felt impossibly vast and intimately small all at once. Awareness, observation, intent. These were the rules here. The hollow itself seemed to breathe around me, testing, measuring, drawing me deeper into a world I could not comprehend. a story I had only begun to witness. The clearing ahead opened wider than I had anticipated. Moonlight filtered through the branches, pale and fractured, illuminating shapes I could barely comprehend. There, at the far edge, stood the first unmistakable sign of presence. The family. Not all at once, but glimpses. The patriarch, tall and still, his outline sharp against the mist. The matriarch, moving with a deliberate grace, her shadow stretching impossibly long, and children, scattered through the shadows, poised like guardians of the hollow. Their motions were slow, measured and precise, almost ritualistic, and every movement carried purpose. I dared not breathe too loudly, but each inhale was drawn sharply through my teeth. The air was thick, carrying the scent of earth, damp wood, and something subtler, something older, almost metallic, like iron warmed by time. The mist coiled around their feet, shifting like smoke, carrying with it the illusion of movement. For a moment, I could not tell who was standing still and who was gliding, and the uncertainty became a suffocating weight pressing against my chest. Then I noticed the patterns on the ground. Objects arranged deliberately, stones in circles, sticks forming angular shapes, small bundles wrapped in cloth, rituals preserved and enacted over decades. Footprints crisscrossed the clearing, adult and child, human and perhaps not. They overlapped, intersected, and disappeared into the mist, as though the hollow itself had recorded their presence and erased it at will. My gaze moved from figure to figure, but every time I focused, someone shifted, vanished, or appeared where I had not seen them before. The family seemed to orchestrate their visibility, revealing only what they intended, controlling every observation with precision. A low, rhythmic hum began again, vibrating through the earth, the mist, and the very trees themselves. It pulsed in perfect synchrony with the subtle movements of the figures. I realized, with a chill that crawled along my spine, that the family and the hollow were intertwined, almost inseparable. Their awareness extended into the shadows, the mist, the very ground I walked upon. Every movement I made, every step I took, was accounted for, measured, and weighed against some unseen standard. The children, no longer fleeting shapes at the edge of my vision, moved closer. Their faces were pale, eyes reflecting the moonlight, expressionless yet charged with knowledge. One stood perfectly still, head tilted, watching me. My gaze met theirs, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being judged, observed, and recorded. Another child appeared behind a tree, crouched, peering from behind its rough bark like a sentinel. I realized then that every member of this family was trained, molded by generations of isolation, each action deliberate, precise, intentional. I took a cautious step forward. The mist swirled, obscuring the distance, and I thought I glimpsed something behind the matriarch. A figure crouched low, almost human in shape, yet its limbs moved with an unnatural fluidity. My chest tightened. I could feel the weight of the hollow pressing down, the intensity of observation becoming unbearable. I realized that these glimpses, these shadows, these patterns, they were not mere coincidence. I had crossed into a world governed by rules I could not understand, a system of measurement, awareness, and hidden intent that had been perfected over decades. The patriarch moved then, slowly, deliberately. He did not speak, but his presence was magnetic, commanding the attention of everything in the clearing. The children mirrored his movements, small figures responding instantly, in perfect synchronicity, like extensions of him. The matriarch followed her own rhythm, and together they orchestrated the space around them with a precision that made the forest itself seem like an instrument, attuned to their purpose. I could not tell where they ended and the hollow began. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, however unwilling. Objects in the clearing seemed to respond to their presence. Stones shifted imperceptibly, leaves rustled without wind, and small shadows stretched along the ground in shapes I could not recognize. A low scraping echoed from behind the trees, slow and deliberate, accompanying the hum that now swelled in intensity. Each sound seemed synchronized with the movements of the figures, each echo a subtle lesson, a warning, an invitation. I realized, with a growing dread, that I was witnessing the hollow as the family intended it to be witnessed, a calculated display of presence, ritual, and control, designed to impress upon any intruder the boundaries of their world. I dared to take another step. One of the children, tall, pale, eyes unnaturally aware, emerged from the shadows and followed at a measured distance, neither advancing aggressively nor retreating. I could feel the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure. Each step I took accounted for in silence. Another figure slipped between trees behind me, gliding as if floating, observing my every motion. And then I saw something on the ground. A small, carved figure, human-like, with markings that mirrored those in the dirt, faint and intricate. It seemed to pulse in harmony with the hum, as if alive, or as if charged with intent from the family itself. The clearing became a stage. Figures moved in silence, shadows stretched and shifted. Patterns in the earth seemed to breathe. I was trapped in a living tableau, each element deliberate, each movement a part of an incomprehensible order. Fear and fascination intertwined so tightly, I could not distinguish them, and I understood, in that moment, that I had glimpsed only a fragment of the hollow's design, only a hint of the family's twisted, meticulous world. As the mist thickened further, the figures began to fade into it, moving with such subtlety that I could no longer discern them from shadow. Their movements left traces in the dirt, patterns that were not random, footprints that overlapped and vanished, leaving me disoriented. I realized then that the hollow itself was alive in a way I had never imagined. Every sound, every shadow, every shift of mist was part of a carefully maintained orchestration, and I, the intruder, had become an instrument in their design, measured and studied, every heartbeat, every breath, recorded and accounted for in silence. And then, almost imperceptibly, the figures were gone. The mist hung thick and heavy. The patterns in the dirt remained, the carved stones glimmered faintly in moonlight, and the rhythmic hum continued softly, fading into the distance. I was alone, yet profoundly aware of the family's presence, imprinted into the very landscape. The forest was quiet, but it was a quiet that carried weight, knowledge, and intent. I had witnessed their world, and yet I knew I had seen only a fragment of its design, only a shadow of the full depth of what had been cultivated here over generations. As I lingered in the clearing, trying to comprehend the fragments I had witnessed, the hollow itself seemed to whisper its history. The family that had inhabited these mountains for generations was not merely strange or reclusive. They were a product of the land, shaped by isolation, hardship, and the peculiar inheritance of knowledge passed down silently through the ages. Every structure, every pattern in the earth, every movement I had glimpsed was a chapter in a story older than any of the mountains surrounding me. Their ancestors had arrived long before the roads carved through the Appalachian hills, when the land was raw, wild, and unforgiving. They had carved shelter from the forest, cultivated small plots of land hidden in valleys, and learned to survive where others could not. But survival alone did not define them. They cultivated secrecy, observation, and a unique understanding of the natural world that bordered on the mystical. Animals seemed to move around them differently, the forest itself responding to their presence, as if recognizing kinship in those who understood its rhythms. Stories passed down by neighboring communities spoke of a family whose habits were unlike any other. They rarely ventured into nearby towns, and when they did, their appearances were fleeting, their expressions carefully measured. Yet, whispers suggested that those who observed them closely often left with unease that lasted for days. Eyes that watched too closely would notice small patterns. A child always positioned at the edge of a window, a door left slightly ajar to catch a sound, an arrangement of herbs or stones in the yard that mirrored something deeper, more deliberate. It was as though the family had mastered the act of existing invisibly, yet simultaneously asserting control over anyone who intruded upon their domain. The eldest members of the family, whose names were spoken in hushed tones, were said to have had knowledge of the forest that extended beyond ordinary survival. They understood the behavior of animals, the shifts in weather, the subtle signs in the soil that indicated not only the health of the land, but the presence of intruders. And their children were trained from birth in observation, in movement, in silence. They learned the language of the shadows, the rhythm of the wind, and the nuances of sound and light that allowed them to exist in the hollow, unnoticed yet omnipresent. It was not cruelty that defined them, at least not in the conventional sense. It was precision, a careful cultivation of awareness and control. And over the decades, these practices compounded. Each generation inherited the knowledge of the previous, refined and expanded. By the time I arrived in the hollow, the family had existed for decades in near total isolation, a society in miniature, shaped by rules and rituals unknown to the outside world. I followed the path deeper, encountering small homesteads hidden by undergrowth, their exteriors unremarkable, yet meticulously maintained. Inside, the evidence of centuries-old routines was everywhere. Bundles of herbs dried with care, small carvings etched into beams, journals filled with symbols and observations, and implements arranged with meticulous precision. Every object suggested a purpose, a lesson, or a record, each carefully preserved for those who would understand. It was as though the family had created a living archive, a repository of knowledge that extended beyond written language, carried in objects, gestures, and routines. As I observed, I noticed the echoes of isolation etched into their behavior. The children moved with careful attention, their steps deliberate, their glances constantly measuring the space around them. Adults spoke little, but every gesture, every glance, was loaded with meaning. A nod could communicate an instruction, a glance could convey observation, a touch could indicate warning. Silence was their language, observation their tool, and ritual their inheritance. Even in the absence of dialogue, the hollow vibrated with communication, a network of understanding invisible to outsiders, yet unmistakable to those who lived within it. I could sense that generations of repetition had left their mark, not only on the family, but on the land itself. Paths wound in deliberate patterns. Clearings were arranged to allow visibility, yet maintain concealment, and the forest seemed sculpted in ways I could not immediately recognize. Each tree, each stone, each shadow appeared positioned to maximize observation, control, and understanding. It was not merely architecture or landscaping. It was an expression of knowledge, intention, and dominion over a place that existed beyond ordinary perception. As I ventured further, the subtle signs of tradition became more pronounced. Small altars carved into tree roots, patterns of stones and twigs forming concentric shapes, objects hidden within the mist as markers or lessons. Each arrangement suggested a careful mind behind it, and I realized that the family's practices were not haphazard. They were deliberate, systematic, and maintained over decades. They were observers and archivists of the hollow, and anyone who intruded became a part of that living record, recorded in shadows, in patterns, in memory. And then I saw evidence of their training of the young. Children's footprints crossed and recrossed in intricate patterns, smaller figures tracing the paths of their elders, copying movements, gestures, and postures with exacting precision. A small figure paused near a clearing, crouched, head tilted in observation. The eyes, sharp, aware, unflinching, met mine for a fleeting instant. I felt their calculation, their study, and I understood. Every member of this family, even the youngest, had been shaped by generations of discipline and observation. I was intruding upon a carefully cultivated world where awareness and measurement defined existence. Time seemed to stretch differently in the hollow. Moments elongated, shadows shifted unpredictably, and I felt disoriented, unmoored from ordinary perception. The forest itself seemed alive, responding to my presence, echoing my movements, and accentuating every sense. I could feel the weight of history pressing down, centuries of tradition, observation, and mastery over a domain that outsiders barely understood. Every glance, every pattern, every sound carried meaning, and I realized that my intrusion was both noted and accounted for, even as I walked deeper into the family's realm. The matriarch appeared then, silently, emerging from behind a tree. She did not speak, did not gesture, yet her presence conveyed authority, awareness, and command. The children mirrored her movements, small figures responding in perfect synchronicity. The patriarch remained at the edge of the clearing, tall and still, watching, observing, orchestrating without apparent motion. And I understood, with a chill that penetrated to my bones, that I was witnessing not just a family, but a system of control, awareness, and tradition that had been honed over decades of isolation. I had entered a world where nothing was random, where everything had purpose, and where observation was the currency of survival and dominance. I pressed forward into the denser part of the hollow, each step now weighted with the knowledge that the family was aware of my presence, measuring, observing, and cataloguing every movement. The mist thickened, curling around my boots, clinging to my coat, obscuring the ground. Every sound was amplified. The distant creak, the rustle of leaves, the faint snapping of twigs. But layered atop those natural sounds was something else. The soft, deliberate scuff of footsteps that did not match my own. The subtle echo of movement that seemed to follow my pace. I spun, eyes scanning the shadows, but nothing was visible. Yet I knew I was not alone. The first encounter came in the form of a figure emerging from the mist, a child, or at least the shape of one, crouched low among the underbrush. Its head tilted, eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that unnerved me. It did not move closer, but it did not retreat. It simply observed, perfectly still, as if my every thought and intention were laid bare beneath its gaze. I realized, suddenly, that these children were trained observers, conditioned to move silently, to record, to communicate without words. Every gesture, every slight tilt of the head, carried meaning I could not decipher. A second figure appeared, gliding along the edge of the clearing. It was smaller, perhaps younger, yet moved with an unnatural precision. I could hear its breath, soft, steady, but synchronized in a way that suggested calculation. The figures were everywhere and nowhere at once, always present at the periphery of vision, never fully revealed, yet impossible to ignore. The forest itself seemed to bend to their presence. Shadows stretched unnaturally. The mist thickened around them, and even the patterns of light filtering through the trees seemed manipulated to their advantage. I reached a small stream, its surface dark and mirror-like, reflecting shapes that moved just beneath the water's surface. Something shifted in the reflection. A hand, a face, fleeting and indistinct. I recoiled, heart pounding, and the mist responded, thickening, curling like tendrils around my legs. The figures observed silently from the bank, their heads tilted, bodies crouched. And in that instant I understood that the hollow itself was a living stage, the family its orchestrators, and I the unwilling participant. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic tapping, subtle yet deliberate, like fingernails tracing the bark of trees. It moved closer, circling around me, following my path. The tapping was accompanied by a whispering hum, layered, harmonic, almost musical, yet dissonant in a way that set my teeth on edge. I tried to locate the source, but each glance revealed only empty mist and shifting shadows. I felt the hollow constrict around me, the forest pressing in, and the figures, the children, the adults, perhaps even ancestors lingering in spirit, watched from the periphery, their presence heavy, omnipresent. A sudden movement drew my attention to a cluster of trees ahead. The matriarch appeared there, emerging silently, almost ethereal in the silver light. She did not speak, did not gesture, yet her gaze fixed upon me with an authority that transcended words. Behind her, children mirrored her posture, crouched and poised, observing. The patriarch remained distant, a sentinel, orchestrating without motion, his presence commanding the space. The forest seemed to pulse in rhythm with their awareness, shadows stretching and contracting like a heartbeat, patterns on the ground shifting subtly as if alive. I moved cautiously, yet every step I took seemed anticipated. A branch snapped behind me, soft but precise, and a childlike figure appeared instantly, crouched low, head tilted. Eyes met mine, and I felt an invisible pressure, a silent assessment that weighed my presence, my intentions, my very being. I realized that in this hollow, the ordinary rules of observation did not apply. Each shadow, each sound, each pattern was deliberate, calculated over decades, refined over generations. I was not merely witnessing a family. I was witnessing a system, a culture, a world meticulously constructed and preserved in isolation. The encounter escalated when I reached another clearing, larger, more open, revealing the main cabin nestled beneath the slope of the hill. The windows were dark, reflective, catching fleeting glimpses of movement inside. I could see shadows pass along walls, hints of figures bending, crouching, observing. Objects arranged in patterns were scattered throughout the yard. Stones stacked in precise alignments, sticks forming interwoven designs, small bundles of herbs tied with string. The arrangement was deliberate, purposeful, a visual language I could not interpret, yet understood instinctively as a record, a lesson, a system of control. I took another step toward the cabin, the mist thickening around my legs, and saw movement behind a window. The matriarch's face appeared, framed in the pale light, expressionless yet commanding. She did not speak. She only watched. And then the shadows behind her shifted, children moving in unison, small figures performing a silent choreography. A ritual I could not name, but instinctively recognized as sacred, deliberate, and, in its precision, terrifying. I could feel the hollow watching, the forest itself a participant in their control. Every leaf, branch, and shadow choreographed in concert with the family's awareness. A sudden noise from the forest edge startled me. A soft scraping, like claws on wood, deliberate and steady. The children, figures small and pale, emerged from shadows to flank me, their eyes fixed, unblinking, assessing. Each movement was calculated, synchronized with the low hum that now resonated through the clearing. It was more than sound. It was command, a signal, a warning. I realized with a chill that I had crossed entirely into their domain, and the hollow, the family, and the forest itself were intertwined in a way I could neither resist nor comprehend fully. The clearing became a stage for observation. Patterns shifted in the dirt beneath my boots. Rocks glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Sticks arranged in concentric designs seemed to pulse subtly with energy. Every figure moved in deliberate, silent rhythm. The patriarch emerged briefly at the far edge, still, immovable, yet commanding. The matriarch guided the children with subtle gestures, a tilt of the head, a bend of the spine, a glance that sent them into motion. And I, the intruder, felt the full weight of their gaze, their legacy, their orchestrated precision. Fear, awe, and fascination intertwined, leaving me suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, as the children mirrored each of my movements, their small forms gliding through the mist, disappearing and reappearing at the periphery of vision. Every step was accounted for, every motion observed. The forest itself seemed alive, responding to their presence and my intrusion. It was a living tableau, a ritual, a silent choreography performed over decades, generations, centuries. And I understood, with a chill that settled deep in my bones, that I had glimpsed only a fragment of the hollow's design, only a shadow of the family's intricate, terrifying, and meticulous world. As the mist thickened and shadows deepened around me, I realized that the clearing, the cabin, and the forest itself were all parts of a carefully orchestrated theater, one that the family had perfected over generations. I had glimpsed the movements of the children, the subtle commands of the matriarch, the quiet authority of the patriarch, and the deliberate arrangement of every object in the hollow. But what I was about to witness was beyond what I could have imagined. A culmination of decades, perhaps centuries, of observation, ritual, and secrecy. I moved closer to the main cabin, my senses hyper-aware of every sound and shift around me. The rhythmic hum that had accompanied my journey through the hollow now became layered with subtle undertones, notes almost imperceptible, yet charged with intent. Each pulse seemed to resonate with the clearing itself, with the earth beneath my boots, with the very mist curling around the trees. The family had built not just a home, but a domain where every detail, every breath, every shadow was calibrated to maintain awareness, control, and legacy. Through the window, I caught sight of a scene that made my pulse seize. The matriarch stood in the center of the room, small figures flanking her in deliberate formation. Objects were arranged around them, stones, sticks, bundles of dried herbs, forming geometric patterns I could not name, yet instinctively recognized as symbols of intent. One of the children moved forward to place a new object within the arrangement, kneeling carefully, bowing ever so slightly, then retreating to their position at the edge of the room. The precision, the ritualistic repetition, the discipline. It was mesmerizing and horrifying, all at once. I realized that the children's every movement was a performance of learning, observation, and obedience. And I, standing outside the window, was simultaneously witness and participant. Every step I had taken, every sound I had made, had been accounted for, silently evaluated by this family, whose world I had dared to enter. The patriarch moved then, slowly, to the edge of the arrangement. He did not speak, but his presence alone commanded the room. The children responded instantly, subtle gestures coordinating their positions with his movements, an unspoken language perfected over generations. My mind raced, trying to understand the structure, the rules, the meaning of this gathering. It was clear. This was not play. This was education, ritual, and preservation of a system entirely foreign to outsiders. And yet, the precision and discipline suggested a darker undercurrent, a strict adherence to secrecy and control that bordered on obsession. From the shadows at the back of the cabin, I noticed glimpses of smaller figures, barely visible. Perhaps younger children, perhaps something else entirely. Their eyes glimmered with awareness beyond what seemed natural. They observed the proceedings silently, learning, memorizing, internalizing the rhythm and flow of this clandestine world. I understood then that the family had created not just a domain of survival, but a living archive of behavior, passed down meticulously from one generation to the next. And I, a stranger intruding into this hollow, had become a recorded event within that archive. A sudden sound, the scrape of wood against wood, delicate yet deliberate, drew my gaze to the corner of the room. A small figure moved along the edge, placing objects carefully, aligning patterns, maintaining order. The attention to detail was extraordinary. The hollow, the family, the mist, the shadows, they were all in harmony, orchestrating a world I had barely begun to comprehend. I felt simultaneously terrified and in awe. I had entered a place governed not by conventional rules, but by precision, observation, and deliberate control. As the night deepened, the matriarch stepped forward, holding a small, intricately carved object. She placed it within the central arrangement, and the children responded with synchronized movements, kneeling, retreating, bowing, observing, all in perfect harmony. The object itself seemed to pulse faintly, almost alive, as though charged with the legacy and intent of the family. I could feel the weight of history, ritual, and tradition pressing down through the walls, the earth, the mist, and into my very chest. Every breath I took was measured, every movement noted, every thought seemingly anticipated by those unseen observers. I stepped back into the clearing outside, my mind racing to process what I had witnessed. The figures inside continued their ritual undisturbed, shadows shifting in harmony with their actions. I realized with a chill that the family had not merely adapted to isolation, they had perfected it. They had created a world entirely governed by awareness, observation, and ritualized behavior, where every action had meaning, every object carried purpose, and every living being, human or otherwise, participated in the continuum of knowledge and control. The children now moved among the trees outside, silent, observing, always aware. Their small forms seemed to merge with the mist, their motions a mirror of what I had seen inside the cabin. It was a continuity of practice, a living testament to the family's meticulous discipline. The hollow itself responded to their presence, shifting subtly, guiding, shaping, measuring. I understood then that the forest, the land, and the family were inseparable, a single, living entity ancient, precise, and wholly alien to the world beyond. I turned to leave, but the weight of observation did not relent. Footsteps echoed behind me, soft, measured, in rhythm with the low hum that resonated through the hollow. Figures flitted between shadows, just at the edge of perception, always watching, always recording. I realized with a sinking certainty that the family's reach extended far beyond the cabin, far beyond the clearing, into every corner of the hollow. And I, a stranger, a witness, would forever be part of their record, an event preserved in shadow, mist, and observation. As I retraced my steps through the forest, the fog thickened, curling around me in silent recognition. Every path I had taken, every stone I had touched, every shadow I had disturbed was accounted for. The rhythmic hum persisted, fading gradually, yet lingering in my ears, in my chest, in my mind. The forest itself exhaled, and the hollow seemed to settle back into its ancient equilibrium. I left the clearing, yet the weight of what I had witnessed followed me. The family, the children, the rituals, the meticulous precision, they were no longer distant, abstract stories. They were imprinted on my perception, an indelible mark of a world hidden from ordinary eyes. Even now, years later, I can feel the hollow watching. On quiet nights, I hear echoes of the low hum, subtle movements at the edge of vision, shadows that shift in ways impossible to explain. The hollow, the family, the legacy, they are timeless, patient, and ever-present. And I know that they continue to exist, hidden in the mountains of Kentucky, preserving their rituals, observing the world, and ensuring that the knowledge of the hollow endures. I had glimpsed it, but the full extent remains forever beyond comprehension, a testament to the twisted, meticulous, and haunting nature of a family the world will never know. I left the hollow that night, my steps careful, my mind racing, yet the forest seemed to linger with me. Even as the moon faded behind clouds and dawn began to pale the sky, I could feel the weight of the family's gaze pressing silently, relentlessly, against my back. Every sound in the outside world, the rustle of leaves, the creak of a distant branch, even the soft hum of early morning insects, was now tinged with a shadow of that hollow, a reminder that some things exist beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. In the days that followed, I found myself haunted not by visions, but by memory and awareness. The images of the children, perfectly still and impossibly attentive, the objects arranged with exacting precision, the hushed, orchestrated movements of the adults, and the rhythm of the low, almost imperceptible hum, all replayed in my mind with clarity that blurred the line between memory and presence. It was as though the hollow had marked me, stitched itself into my perception, and left me carrying its weight wherever I went. Sleep offered no relief. In the darkness of my own room, I would hear whispers of movement at the periphery of vision, faint tapping echoing in rhythm with my heartbeat, shadows that shifted ever so slightly, as if watching from angles impossible to detect. I realized then that the hollow had not ended with my departure. It had followed me. And with that realization came a deeper, more unsettling truth. The family's legacy, their rituals, and their observation extend beyond place. They exist wherever their story is remembered, wherever their patterns are contemplated, wherever curiosity dares to intrude. I have tried to forget, to dismiss it as imagination or the lingering fear of isolation, yet each time I close my eyes, the hollow stretches before me once more. Every object, every pattern, every shadowed movement, alive in memory, alive in my perception, reminds me that some worlds are too precise, too deliberate, and too persistent to ever truly leave. And I am left with the unshakable question that no one outside that hollow can answer. When you step into a world so carefully observed, so meticulously preserved, can you ever truly step away? Even now, years later, I hear faint echoes of that low hum in quiet moments. I see shadows that move just at the edge of my vision, and I feel the weight of observation pressing lightly but unmistakably against my awareness. I know, as I always will, that the hollow exists still, preserved by the family, their children trained in silence, the forest itself an extension of their meticulous vigilance. And I know that anyone who dares enter that hidden world risks becoming part of a story they may never leave behind. So I ask you, the listener, the witness from the safety of your own world, if you were given the choice, would you step into that hollow? Would you dare observe what the family intends to keep unseen? Or would you, like most who hear this story, hesitate, turn away, and leave the shadows and the hum undisturbed, forever wondering what lives there, unseen and always watching? Because the hollow is patient, and it remembers.